Welcome back to the channel. I'm alive. About 41% of you decided to vote for a debunking video. So this is going to be a debunking video. You will notice I do not have my notebook. I'm actually being modern. I'm hoping with having a script, I'm going to be less inclined to go on tangents. Presently, this introduction was only supposed to be this long, and I'm already on a tangent, so I'm not seeing this working out that well. We're going to cover one of the pseudo-history topics that I keep seeing pop up on TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, and it's about the era I study. See, normally they're about Atlantis and ancient Egypt and things like that, which, yeah, I know a good bit about ancient Egypt. I'm familiar with the Atlantis myth, but it's not really a focus of this channel. This one is. Uh, Might as well just throw my little sales pitch here at the beginning. We're not sponsored by anybody. I make hats and clothing and stuff from the 17th century. If you're into pirates, reenacting, etc., feel free to hit us up on Facebook. If you wish to donate to help us keep growing, we have a GoFundMe and we have Patreon, which I haven't really put anything on Patreon recently because we just don't really have that many people on it. So I'm hoping to start actually having some behind the scenes stuff. If you join, there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff. You'll get to learn some things that I've been working on. You also get to see me rant about fabric. So there's that. Uh, let's get into it. Disclaimer. Even wrote out the disclaimer. See? Getting good at this stuff. I'm going to try to approach this topic as fairly as I can. That said, as you will soon learn, there is very little room to do so. A bit of my credentials. One of the channels apparently does not believe that I'm actually a historian because I don't type like one. I don't know what I'm supposed to be typing. I'm trying to be a human, but I have a bachelor's of humanities from Penn State. I did some honorable time in the army, and yes, I've even gone to jail. I've seen quite a few sides of government, and I need to stress on that last point. I am extremely critical of it. If you've got a good conspiracy, hey, I'm all ears. I got a few of my own, but now, am I a historian? Yes. Not only did I learn the process in college, but I regularly use it while I'm digging through archives, museums, etc., to learn new information. I try to be informal in this channel because, frankly, I do find my discipline to be a little bit pretentious. Am I a professional? I would say yes, in that I do use history on a regular basis for my business. But if somebody with like a master's or a doctorate of history chose to say that I was not, I wouldn't lose sleep over it. It's not a big deal to me. Now, two words which are very important when discussing literally anything with society are misinformation and disinformation. They're two different things. To put it bluntly, we have all suffered misinformation at some point in time, whether it be a misinformed teacher, if you get tired and read something the wrong way and then remember it the wrong way, or we misinterpret a situation. People thinking Columbus discovered that the world is round. That is misinformation. Nobody meant harm with the story, and quite a few people over the years have just accepted it. They don't know any better. Disinformation, however, is when people intentionally put out false or misleading claims. Guaranteed, you have encountered it a lot recently, especially with the United States having its election cycle. It's also very common during times of war, which, again, our world's experiencing right now. Being misinformed can be dangerous. It's normally not, but it can be. Disinformation is almost always dangerous. Getting used to it opens your mind up to even more and more disinformation. Disinformation usually will start small and then it keeps growing into something more and more serious. As I discuss this topic, I want you to think for yourself whether or not you feel this is a case of misinformation or disinformation. Tartaria. I've been begging others to cover this topic for a while now, but after digging, I can see why they might not want to. Whereas the alien, Atlantis, and high technology conspiracies all tend toward being evidence based, even if it's widely misinterpreted, it is still grounded in reality, where scholars can have a proper rebuttal. Problem is, a lot of these Tartarian conspiracy theorists do not work that way. Everything from a scholar is a lie. It's not. I mean, I'm hopefully telling you the truth here, but Zach Mortiz, writing for Bloomberg, describes Tartaria as the QAnon of architecture. Please, you two, don't ban me for saying that. I feel it's very fitting. I know I don't bring politics onto this channel, but this is a case where we are going to have to enter into that realm a little bit. Some of you who are familiar with old maps are probably screaming, but Tartaria is real. Yes, yes, it was. Variations on the name all tend toward the steppe regions within Central Asia. Depending on the document, Tartar usually refers to the Mongols or various offshoots. So what happened? Let me start by saying Genghis Khan is often discussed in the same realm as Vikings, ninjas, and pirates. Who doesn't want to ride off with a horde of nomadic horsemen and conquer most of the known world? And also create a scenario where your genetics are still present in large populations today. Genghis Khan. As much as I'd love to research a video on the Mongols, that is sadly not the direction of this conspiracy. Like, I remember in the time period, as we'll discuss, like when this started to come about as a theory, like, I don't know if you ever heard the band The Who, they were becoming popular. There was this really weird, like, kind of like the trend with, does your boyfriend think about ancient Rome? The same thing was going on with the Mongols. Like, I actually think I think about the Mongols more than ancient Rome. But a few debunkers have taken the route of going after Anatoly Fomenko's new chronology. To summarize, basically all history happened later and was rewritten by the Jesuits. Genghis Khan was actually Russian and conquered all of the known world, and this empire was defeated in 1775. In this case, if it's not entirely obvious, this view is very nationalistic. Fomenko is Russian, placing Genghis Khan, who conquered most of the known world, at. Yeah. Fomenko believes literally all history was rewritten, and such studies such as dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, are cover ups. Even Jesus was apparently born later. I think he actually has him listed as being born in the 1200s. Fomenko is very likely where this idea started, but it's very doubtful any of these theorists on YouTube or TikTok are even familiar with him. So, what happened? I was not satisfied with blaming an author for this movement. Like, it might have been seeded with some of his ideas, but I don't think that's where a lot of these theorists are getting them. He's not mentioned in the same way that, like, say, Graham Hancock, Scott Walter, or Ignatius Donnelly, they're mentioned. He just doesn't appear. Tartarian theorists tend to be extremely disjointed and don't quite agree on their timelines or events. More than any other group, they tend to use the phrase of, I'm just asking questions. And they also tend to have the tone of, I'm just asking questions. I don't understand. They all talk like that. I don't know why. They it's they got stuck in Napoleon Dynamite and never left. I'm gonna try not to insult anybody's character in this, by the way. It's just a thing I've noticed in how they articulate their words. Whereas I'm saying, this is the deal, this is what happened, this is what happened. They're, I don't know. I think this is from an ancient civilization. Tartaria seems to be largely an online phenomenon. Yes, there are books. A lot of them are fairly new. But the bulk of what we see and hear in posts and videos do not reference any of the books. So in fairness, I turn to Google Analytics. If you're ever trying to figure out where something began, go to Google Analytics and it will use and he's rephrases. If you want to figure out where something gained popularity on the internet, since I think about 2004, hop onto Google Analytics and it will tell you when something was searched for. So nearly all the words associated with this conspiracy, Tartaria, mud flood, reset, they all begin around 2016, 2017, and then they skyrocketed during the pandemic in 2020. It follows the same trends as the anti vax movement and certain political movements. Now, and I do have some views that I have no problems putting out here on the channel. Considering I've mentioned that Cotton Mather, one of the few good points about him was that he was pro inoculation. I really hope my stance on vaccines has not turned any of you off. If it did, I actually don't care. Uh, Vaccines are real. This time period is where they started being developed. If you don't understand the science, find somebody that does, and don't just parrot talking points. This whole video is going to be about, hey, gotta be careful out there. There's people that don't mean the best for you. I'm hoping at the end of this video, you might start having you might be able to be a little more critical of some of the stuff you see on the internet. So let's talk about the resets. The Tartarian worldview is full of the idea of civilizations rising to a technological peak and then being destroyed. Most of the purveyors of the view seem to think that things were much better and potentially more sophisticated in the past. So, whereas you might say, oh, yeah, Rome was pretty advanced for its time, or their medicine, we didn't really see medicine that good until about 17th, 18th century. Okay. They're to the point, though, of viewing that the world of Tartaria was more advanced than we are right now. Lucius Aurelian, he's one of the folks on YouTube, seems to think that ancient civilizations were even more advanced than the Tartarians. There's a lot of talk about vibrations and spirituality. Not really going to get into that, but we're talking about actual technology. We know roughly how the Egyptians built the pyramids and other monuments. There's some doubts in, oh, did they do this or did they do that? But we know roughly how they did things. If you want like a full length discussion on that, Dr. Miano, Dr. Gibble, and everybody's favorite Google debunker, Mini Minuteman, they've all done videos on this topic. Definitely check out their videos. I am not an archaeologist or an Egyptologist. They have a lot more insight into this topic than I do. I can definitely talk at length on it, but it's not going to be as accurate as what they can deliver. So I'm going to include links to their channels. Yeah, check them out. Definitely, if you like this stuff, subscribe to them because they got a lot more than me. My focus tends to be on the colonial period before the American Revolution. So basically, with the resets, all you need to know is civilizations rise and they fall. There's not a problem with that. The problem with it is they think the civilizations of the past were way more advanced than we are today. And one of their civilizations, Tartaria, existed within technically the living memory of some, depending on where you want to end it. Let's get the band-aid off, though, on something else. Is it racist? I know this word carries a lot of weight with it, so stick with me, stick with me. I don't feel that many of the Tartarian believers are, in fact, racist. That said, when we start denying where people came from, who they were, or their accomplishments, yeah, we are entering into that realm. Given that the idea of Tartaria began from a nationalistic person, it's definitely worth discussing. I'm not going to name the channel in this context because, again, I don't believe the guy is racist. But when people start claiming indigenous cultures couldn't possibly be because of 19th century anthropology, which at the time was 100% racist and continued to be, especially in some countries into the 20th century, we do need to stop and talk about this. Uh, Anthropology today is not racist, but a lot of the views of those who started anthropology as a study, it was in that time period of like measuring people's skulls and things like that. So the big claim in the theory on the video I saw, and I did some shorts on it. Again, you can look this guy up, but don't harass him over it. I don't think he means to be. I also, again, maybe I should have said this at the beginning. Don't harass any of these people. I'm hoping some of them hop on here and maybe give me some actual evidence that we can work on. We could actually have a dialogue about. That would be great. But don't go out of your way to just like bombard their channel. Number one, it feeds the algorithm and makes people think that this is something good. And number two, people can get mean on the internet. I don't like that. Don't be mean. So the big claim in his video was that the Susquehannock came from Carthage. Yeah, that Carthage. The evidence cited were fake pictographs and canals and other structures that we know were built in the 19th century. He's literally walking along a waterfront in, I believe it's Columbia, Pennsylvania, and he's picking up random scraps. Columbia was an industrial area. Like, early on, they started having industry. There's a lot of old factories which still stand in. There's one that recently burned down, sadly, a house and antique shop. But there's a lot of reason for there to be rubble along the river. And he also talks about canals. He does a full length on canals at one point. But he's associating all of that with the Susquehannock, except they're not indigenous. They are from Carthage. Now, I've done a few discussions on the canals in the shorts. Go back, check them out if you want. I don't feel like spending a whole video talking about them, because it would take a whole video. They are definitely worth a discussion. If you guys want me to talk about them, feel free. It gives me a reason to go walk several blocks down and start exploring some of them. Now, here's the kicker of this whole thing. Like, normally it'd be like, well, the Susquehannock didn't build stone monuments. They actually did. And that's the cool thing that we're missing. Right near where this guy's at, there's even some that are potentially undiscovered. We're finding them every so often, new ones are found, especially with Google Maps. Now that we can actually just get an overhead view from the comfort of our home, people are finding these things. The Susquehannock built eel weirs. They're basically triangular shaped trap used to catch eels and get them funneled into an area so they could harvest them. Some of them got quite extensive. We're talking these were built across the river. Now, those of you who know the Susquehanna, you're familiar with the way that river can be. That river can be nice 1 second, and then next second you're running into a sinkhole or something because of the limestone. You couldn't just walk across and do it. Now, drought, possibly. They could have used canoes. But here's the thing. Some of these, well, many of them predate Columbus. They were building these things roughly 400 years ago, at least. Some might even be older. And they are still here. Even with all the boat traffic, with fishermen, earlier with factories and barges, there is still these weirs out in the river. Now, are they a pyramid? No, but I think they're a lot cooler. So, you got a pyramid being made for some rich dead guy. Great, great. These were made so people could have something to eat. Like, it's important. Pay attention to that. And they're complex. The ones very near to me, they are extremely complex. And you get some that are just giant. They're awesome. They seem mundane, but they're awesome. And definitely, that's something that instead of doing videos about maybe the Susquehannock were from Carthage, I'm just asking questions. Looking at things like that, that's real archaeology. And it's really like, it's not studied that much. That's something that archaeologists should be studying. That's something like, hey, why don't you guys check this out? We need to figure out when this was made. Are there more? There's archaeologists that are doing that. But trying to get people more interested in stuff like that, that's what gets archaeologists excited because they get to dig into things that they might not get funding for. If you get excited about that, then the right people will have the right grants and they get to do it. The fake pictographs really irritate me because not only are they forgeries, and that's a huge problem in the field to begin with, especially with 19th century archaeologists or antiquarians, I think we should call them. They were bad forgeries. Like, you look at them, you made that in your garage, bud. That's not real. And some of the discussions in the comments started getting a little spicy. Not about, well, it's not real, which that would have been great. No, they were getting into, well, I mean, I mentioned the problem with some of these conspiracy theories earlier. The other thing that irritates me about them, we actually have pictographs in the Susquehanna River. Literally, I'm going to say, if he was saying he was roughly about Columbia, maybe about 15 minutes away from him, depending on car, depending where he was at, there are actual pictographs in the Susquehanna River. You have to get out with a boat. Sometimes when the water level's low, you can walk out. There's literal rock art that might actually predate the Susquehannock. There's been a lot of folklore about them, but not a lot of archaeology. They're they're awesome. Like, if you ever get the chance to check them out, I know Uncharted Lancaster does tours out to it. Do it. They're incredible and they're ancient. Like, it's one of those chances when a lot of people in North America, we don't get the chance to. I explored an ancient site. This is an example of an ancient site. It's one that it's not just like, oh, I found some stones and some charcoal. Obviously, there was a camp here. No, this is one of those sorts of finds where it's like, this is like, it's, wouldn't call it monumental, but it's, that charcoal could have been from a forest fire. The stone, yeah, there's ways to tell. Flint Dibble's father, he did a lot of work with flint knapping. There's ways to tell if something was flaked by a human or if it like fell the right way. But it's still not, unless it's like a really nice point. Most people don't really get excited about that. These, however, they've got mythology. Like, it's something very human, and it's so worth a visit if you get the chance. Like, that's real history. That's real archaeology. It's not, I'm just asking questions. Sorry, that annoys me. Just as a side, I am so not used to doing these videos, so it's like, man, I need a drink. I'm back. I don't know if I'm gonna have that part in there. So, one of the more annoying things about these conspiracies is they'll pick and choose what they use from the archaeological record, or in this case, the historical record. This YouTuber mentions that the Susquehannock were described by John Smith as being taller than Europeans and other tribes. this has led to a lot of the giant myths. Yes, I told you at the beginning there's going to be a little connection. I didn't realize how pervasive it was, but there's quite a few Tartarian folks who believe that giants are real, and they were actually the Tartarians. I can't make this stuff up. Like, I write sci-fi. Some of you know that. Some of these theories, they would never make it past my editor. My editor would be like, "This is so unbelievable. Your book's not going to sell. Don't even bother." Yeah. So we do know that Susquehannock were actually taller. We do know that, but they weren't giants. They were likely roughly modern height. So we'll go 5'9" to 6 foot. So for you using non-freedom measurements, around 2 meters, a little less. Nothing outrageous for our time period. 17th century, though, Europeans were fairly short. Most people in the world were fairly short. You're looking around uh, 5'2", 5'3", in that realm, maybe a little taller, but they would be noticeably, the Susquehannock would have noticeably have been taller. Again, not giants, not supernatural. Because of the archaeology, we know why. And I think there's been some bone analysis done. Don't quote me on that. But just a study of their sites, we know that they were eating. They were eating well. They weren't malnourished like most of the rest of the world was. That was allowing them to get to a normal height. A lot of their settlements were fortified. They had a pretty strong, I'm saying military, but their warriors were pretty good at their job. And they kept their society safe. So not only were they not really having to deal with so much violence, but they were eating well. A lot of the world did not have that luxury. Now, this YouTuber also gets into weapons. So he's not he's not wrong in the concept, he's wrong in the specifics. So let's start with his point first. He believes that the Susquehannock had their own independent firearms technology, that they were building cannon, and they also developed the Kentucky repeating rifle. This is all incorrect. The Susquehannock did trade with the French, English, and the Dutch. Just like in the video where I talk about higher weapons, they would have had access to flintlock technology long before their English counterparts, say Jamestown. So, yeah, technically speaking, they were more advanced to up until right around 1700 or so. Yes, they would have technically been more advanced than the Europeans, but they were using European weapons. Susquehannock were also one of the only tribes that did get a hold of artillery. They didn't build it themselves. They traded for it. In fact, going back to where this guy was located at when he did this video, more than likely they traded for the cannon somewhere in central Pennsylvania. So looking at maybe between modern day Harrisburg and Columbia. Now, the rifle that he is talking about, I think he's talking about the Pennsylvania long rifle. There was repeating firearms technology going back very early. but it wasn't commonplace. It was very complex. The Kentucky rifle, which developed from the Pennsylvania rifle, this really annoys me because he thinks we're hiding history from him. He thinks we're rewriting it. We've known for a very long time where the Pennsylvania rifle was developed. We know some of the families that were involved. We know it started in Lancaster. In fact, taking my wife to the hospital when she had our daughter, I remember driving past one of the workshops. There's actually a sign along the road telling you where it was at. They were German immigrants. If you look at the Pennsylvania rifle and you look at German Jaeger at that time, there's a lot of similarity. Some of the differences, like the Pennsylvania long rifle, is long. It's longer than a lot of the German made guns in Germany. Reason behind that is the English tend to prefer a longer barrel. You see that with the Boucanier guns. You see that with the fowling pieces, like the stuff we've talked about before. But again, we know who the folks were. And it's been a tradition that's continued. There are people today that are still making Pennsylvania long rifles in their traditional ways because these guns were so popular, so valuable. People took care of them. We have a lot of original examples around. Uh, I can't link any places to buy things, but I will include one of the YouTubers that does do a lot of deep dives into long rifles. Uh, if you go to our Facebook, I know I've mentioned a few vendors before, FYI. If you get a chance to go to some of the rendezvous and some of the shows, all you have to do is ask around, and you will find people that can probably recite the history. Like, it's not, this is stuff that people are obsessed with. This is stuff that's like passed down through families. It's amazing, and it's an art form, and it's actually like when I complain sometimes about like well, YouTube's treatment, well, social media's treatment in general to gun people. This is one of these things. This is one of these topics where it's like, I wish some of these folks could do a lot more content because it's art. It's not. You're not going to be. You're not going to be doing illegal things with these guns. They're an art form. You might go hunting with them. You might like do contests and things. They are, again, they're beautiful. It's an art form, and it's one that we have a long tradition of doing, especially here in Pennsylvania in the Northeast. So, yeah, check the description. I'll have some links. Now, we have to go back to something I said earlier. Is this theory racist? I don't think the guy is being racist. I think he's parroting things that he heard from other people. I don't think he actually means any harm by it. The problem is there are a lot of there were a lot of dog whistles in the comments. And he's not trying to do anything to counteract them. We know who the Susquehannock were. We know what happened to them. Honestly, I do want to do a video on it because I do work with some sites that had involvement in what happened to them. It's sad. It's tragic. It's one of those things where we shouldn't be making up stories about them. That brings us to the mud flood. So the Tartarian, I'm just going to call it the annoying T. The annoying T end time seems to be some sort of worldwide flood of mud, either caused by a disaster or some sort of super weapon, and it happened somewhere between 1775 and 1945. Depends who you ask. So what's the evidence? Basement windows. Those. According to annoying tea believers, these sorts of things were on the surface. That would have been your first floor. Having been in plenty of basements they use as evidence, not sure why you'd want those as your entranceway to your home. I mean, they are usually unfinished. A lot of the ones in the time period had a dirt floor. It's not really my place to judge taste. But just saying, if you're this all-conquering empire, I don't think you want basically a stone-lined pit to be your entrance. My grandparents built their home with basement windows in the 1960s. I grew up with them. They had the basement was partially finished, and although it was technically the front of their house, if you're driving along, you're going to see the basement first. The actual entrance was around back upstairs. It was on the side of a hill. Now, in all fairness, there are places in the world where cities, buildings have sunk over time. There's a lot that happens over the centuries. Some of these buildings, the ones they're talking about, are usually, they're not even that old, and it's a basement window. Buildings that I could see them maybe thinking that, they're hundreds of years old. In the case of some of the churches, like you've had multiple reburials, you've had stacks and stacks of graves on top of each other. Happens a lot in the cities. Happened a lot because of the plagues. So yeah, the ground's higher than the church itself. Well, the entrance to the church is not higher than the church. That would be a little weird. Then I'd actually start asking questions. If you want to see some of this build up in the United States, you can see it with roads, especially outside of some of the older cities like Philadelphia. You'll be driving along and the embankments are really steep. You wonder why they, like the land around us is fairly flat. Why'd they dig it in so deep? They didn't. It's some of them started out as Indian trails and then gradually evolved into roads for carts and eventually got paved. And just about 300 years of use, they start sinking down. Uh, some of the melted building people get confused because the same thing happens with stone stairs. Just constant wear over the centuries, especially some of the buildings that might have, like a temple that was repurposed into a church and then a fort and then it became a tourist site. People have been walking on those for centuries, possibly millennia. You can even see it, some of the, unless they remodeled it, you can see it in Gettysburg sometimes because there'll be some of the monuments built maybe 100 years ago during like 1920s. You can see divots from all the tourists walking up over the century. There's nothing weird about it. Like, in that case, you can literally watch it happen. Another example that they use for this mud flood are places that have large pilings or complex foundations. Things like you'd see in a lot of coastal or river cities. Uh, so some of them will cite Seattle, which I think that's good evidence. It's wrong because we have photographic proof and we have a lot of written documents. But Seattle, there's parts of Seattle that are built on top of old Seattle. You can literally explore the 19th century city by going under the new city. It's really cool. If you ever get a chance, check it out. It's awesome. We know why that happened. For some reason, I don't usually see these posts. I see them when they show pictures of one of my favorite examples, St. Petersburg. So St. Petersburg is built on pilings. Let's talk about why. Peter the Great commissioned it as a Western European style city in a literal swamp. He wasn't making friends with anyone doing this. So there's no reason to protect him. and he used architects and engineers from Europe. So, no matter your language, you can probably find somebody that's talking about it. Now, before I begin the description of this, if that dude Baltic Empire or his alternate personality, Golden Gunpowder, wants to critique my pronunciations, have at it. I'm going to butcher these. In 1611, Swedish colonists founded Nyenskans. What is this word? Sorry, guys. It was a fort at the mouth of the Neva River. Many people moved into the area, and it became a very diverse settlement. You had Finns, you had Estonians, Poles, Russians. Everybody's moving in here. There's going to be a port. And its location made it perfect to trade with Western Europe. At the end of the 17th century, Peter the Great wanted a port with better access to the rest of Europe. On May 12, 1703, this is how accurate the information is on this. During the Great Northern War, Peter the Great captured Nyenskans. I'm hoping I get this right. I'm trying so hard. So he decided to start a new fortress a little bit closer. It would be called the Peter Paul Fortress, and it was built on Zayaki Island. In English, it's known as Hare Island. The bunny rabbit as opposed to hare. Look like a goober. It was planned from the beginning to be a new city built with all the latest understanding of architecture and engineering. Such names as architect Domenico Trezzini, a Swiss Italian, and Jean-Baptiste Alexandre Leblanc, a Frenchman who was also Peter the Great's chief architect, would contribute to this construction project. The city would become and remain a Baroque masterpiece. It, of course, suffered many disasters such as fires, revolutions, and war, and quite a few renamings. But much of the original structure still survives to this day. Again, it is not a mystery. It is well documented. We have the architectural plans, we have the letters, we have the orders, we even have the complaints. Everything is right there. You might have to speak Russian or other languages other than English to study it, but it's there. We know about it. We even know what Peter the Great was doing. We know who he would go out to drinks with in England. We have this information. It's awesome. You can search it on Google. That's what it means to do your own research, by the way. Look at archives. Don't just parrot what somebody on TikTok told you. Sorry. This is going to be this conspiracy theory annoys me probably more than any other because it's my era. But that fort. So according to Tartarian believers, star forts are actually the foundations of a power plant or an alien spaceship launch pad. I don't know, and frankly, I don't think they have fully ironed out what it's supposed to be. Thing is, though, we know what star forts are. They were developed during the Renaissance. Among the names attached to their development is one that many of you might know, Michelangelo, the Ninja Turtle. I mean, the artist. They're set lower in the landscape to be less of a target for direct fire weapons. The walls are casemates filled with dirt to better absorb incoming rounds. The moats are wide and are covered from multiple angles to give much better overlapping fields of fire. Some of them are quite complex, while others are fairly simple. The best part with star forts, although I have never been to Egypt, I've never explored pyramids, I have plenty of stories of getting trashed and exploring star forts. Trust me, If you want to uncover mysteries of a star fort, let a bunch of 20-somethings with vodka loose on one and also claim it's haunted. Don't do that. That's dangerous. Really dangerous. Do not recommend.
An hour drive from me is Fort Mifflin, right along the Delaware River. It survived the American Revolution, reenactors, and Boy Scouts. Little inside joke there. It served as a functional fort, a prison, modern military base, a site for raves, and as a museum. It was initially settled in 1681, but was largely left undefended because William Penn, as a Quaker, rejected the military life and chose to make peace with the local indigenous tribes. As many of you know from my Pennsylvania video, Markham and others also worked with pirates to secure the area. No military was needed. Benjamin Franklin, during King George's War, raised the money to construct a primitive fortification with artillery to protect against the French and Spanish privateers who were entering the Delaware and threatening trade. At the end of the war, nothing further came of the fort. Even during the 7 Years' War, plans were made, but nothing was built. In 1771, with the colonists getting a bit drunk and profane, as my old history teacher used to put it, the British finally decided to act. Captain John Montresor was tasked with coming up with a plan. After much haggling, construction began. And then Montresor got annoyed at everyone and returned to New York. The crews only built the south and east walls. Once more, Benjamin Franklin entered the scene as part of the Philadelphia Committee of Public Safety. The committee moved forward and restarted construction. The fort was completed by 1776. The defenders extended the fortifications, placing large wooden spikes in the river to stop ships. The Delaware between Fort Mifflin and Fort Mercer, which is across the river in New Jersey, was well defended. During 1777, the British attacked Fort Mifflin. 250 out of the 450 men guarding the fort were killed or wounded. These, like, actual people died defending that fort. Fort Mifflin never again saw action. The fort was rebuilt in 1793 as part of the coastal defenses of the new United States. Louis de Toussaint, follower of Lafayette, also apologize if my French pronunciation's off, helped not just to revamp the fort, but also wrote one of the books which would eventually lead to the foundation of the West Point Military Academy. Go Army! Fort Mifflin would continually be built upon until 1820, when Fort Delaware would relegate it as a second line defense. There were renovations afterward. During the American Civil War, it became a prison for Confederates and even civilian prisoners, specifically draft dodgers. There was a whole draft dodging movement in eastern Pennsylvania. Many of them were taken to Fort Mifflin. The thing is, at Fort Mifflin itself, the graffiti from those prisoners survives to this day. After the war, renovations would continue. But later on, during World War II, anti-aircraft guns were positioned on Fort Mifflin, and naval ammunition was stored at the fort and guarded by the Marine Corps. Then in 1954, the fort was decommissioned. In 1960 and again through the 1980s, the fort was continued to be renovated. As of a few months ago, it now has new roofs. This was a very brief summary. I could probably do an entire video on Fort Mifflin. I would love to do a site visit, check it out, and show you some of this. In short, we know who built the fort. We also have complaints. We have letters. We have plans. We have, again, we know the people. We know people that were involved. This isn't some mystery. And the thing is, the fort is open to the public. You can visit it. If you dig deep enough, there are supply orders. The only weird things I have ever encountered at the fort. So There's a big claim that the fort is haunted. Y'all know I'm very skeptical. I've mentioned this before in a few videos here and there. One night, a whole bunch of us were there, and we went and used the restroom. We're waiting, and it was around 3 a.m. and the payphone started ringing. First thing we notice, the payphone is unplugged. Well, somebody answered it. There was nothing on the other line, on the end of the line. Now, given that the site regularly uses ghost tours as a way to raise revenue, could it have been some sort of a marketing thing? Or was it something supernatural? Who knows? Uh, there's also a lot of giant rats at Fort Mifflin. It's Philadelphia. It's literally at the end of the airport. A lot of those rats probably provide food for some of the snapping turtles that live in the moat. Yeah, don't go walking around swimming in the moat. As far as weird sounds and vibrations and things like that, one cool thing that I did notice as a reenactor, the fort's bakery, because of the way the ceiling is constructed, because of the stone, it has amazing acoustics. Like, it's a great place if you are doing music, you're having like a little party of some kind. If you're ever at the fort as part of a reenactment group or something, see about using that. You can have live music up front, unplugged, hear it in the back, and still have conversations throughout, and the music doesn't suffer. It's amazing. But we know how that works. We know the shape of the ceiling, the way it's constructed. Not only does it protect against bombardment, but it's an awesome area to do music. I'm not even sure how you get like a pseudo history claim out of it because the bakery's not that big. I mean, you could probably fit a house in there, but it's not something that the right vibration would power a whole city. No, it's not like that. It's an accident of architecture, which it's it's really it's cool. They do a lot of work to try to keep open because it's a beautiful site and there's a lot of associated buildings with it. So they have a lot of events, including, yeah, I kind of mentioned earlier. If you want to get involved, see about becoming a volunteer. If maybe you're too far away, join a reenacting group that does stuff there. You can get behind the scenes and explore it. Uh, the site is very open to hanging out, like for reenactors to explore. As long as you're not doing anything that's going to damage the site, they really don't care. Or damage yourself. So definitely check them out. I'm They're one that I've worked personally with a few times. I know there's quite a few other star forts up and down the East Coast. Again, most of them, like most history sites, need the funding, so they have events. Check them out. There's nothing to hide from you. Another point is we actually have the weapons that were used to combat the forts. It weren't some great super weapons. No, it was usually heavy artillery, some of the early howitzers. That's sort of how howitzers started to become developed because direct fire weapons didn't really work against star forts. So having a weapon that could arc in right there, that is why howitzers and mortars began to be developed. One of the weapons designers was Menno van Cohorn. He was Dutch. He helped develop some of the forts during the Nine Years' War, and he went on to develop a mortar. It was a light mortar designed to be carried by only a small team of infantry. I think his original design was about two people. A lot of teams would be four because the Netherlands and the British were allies at the time. The British started using it very quickly. Now, it's a light mortar. It's not going to destroy a wall, but what it was meant to do is fire a shot over the wall, case shot. It would explode and keep people's heads down so the infantry could advance, so miners could advance, and they could take the walls that way. These things became extremely popular. They were used from the late 17th century. They were notably used during the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and during 1915, they were actually brought out of museums and used in the trenches until the later Stokes mortar could be developed. Once they got the Stokes mortars, yeah, they went back to being museum pieces. The Stokes mortar is roughly what that design is roughly what we have today. So when we're talking about, like when people talk a lot about, man, the oldest weapon we have in the inventory, like I think it's the M2 machine gun, which I qualified on as a tanker. What I think is even more cool, our mortar technology is, I mean, we got new electronics, we got new targeting, we got new ammunition, but the basic design is only one generation away from the Cohorn, which was developed in the late 1600s. To me, that's cool. There have been many variations on mortar designs, but the basic principle of a light infantry portable weapon that Cohorn set out to develop, it remains today. It is still, like, the concept is still on the modern battlefield. Let's talk about fires. So, another point the purveyors of Tartaria like to bring up are the Great Fires. They always cite the 19th century, like Fire Chicago, things, Seattle, things like that. But as many of you know, old cities were also dealing with them before that. London, I've mentioned in the video about Charles II. And then some communities didn't even see their Great Fire until later. Some of you have noticed I do have a slight mocking tone on some of these points. And again, I said I was being fair. One of the videos I watched, actually from the guy talking about Susquehannock, he mockingly goes, and the common narrative is that they were caused by outdated buildings and lack of proper fire safety. That's almost an exact quote, if I remember correctly. Uh, I'm not even sure how to rebuttal this because, yeah, that's what happened. Many of the houses, normal houses, were made out of wood. People were in cramped conditions. They were using wood burning stoves, coal burning stoves. In the case of London, this was centuries of buildup of these old houses, these row homes. Houses were built right next to each other. It's part of why one of the ways they helped defeat the fire was to tear down some of the houses and make a what's called a fire block, I think it's called. I'm probably wrong. But some of the concepts we use in modern firefighting were developed during the Great Fire of London. Once these buildings burned down, they built them better. Now that they learned their lesson, they had spacing in between houses. Actually, part of why William Penn wanted Philadelphia to be more of a park. Now, it's not today, but when they were building the original Philadelphia out of wood, they were still having wood-fired. They were still having wood-fired stoves, things like that. There was distance between the houses. It was to prevent fire. A lot of these cities that were rebuilt, they were rebuilt things like stone, brick, and later concrete and steel. There's still fires today, but they don't spread as fast as they did in the time period. And yeah, there was not proper firefighting equipment. In some cities, you still had bucket brigades. In other places, yeah, they did have a fire hydrant system. Uh, Actually, Penn State Harrisburg, of all the places, they actually have some of the wooden water pipes that would have been used in some of the cities of the time. Any of you familiar with Gangs of New York? That movie. The Plug Uglies, they were one of the gangs in New York at the time. They would actually cover up the plug, the fire hydrant, with a bucket, and they would charge people for them to remove the bucket so that they could put out the fire. Some of the firefighters, like there's a scene in that movie, if I remember correctly, where the firefighters start fighting each other. They were even, some of them were even gangs. We didn't have the modern apparatus we have today. So, yeah, fires would spread. One of the things these purveyors remark on is the lack of soot and charring on buildings that survived. Well, number one, if it's just soot, you're going to wash it off. If you don't wash it off, nobody wants to have a building that looks like it was in a fire. That does not help property value. If you don't wash it off, we've had about a century now of rain, some of it acidic. What do you think happens to that soot? It washes away. Things that would have been too charred, they're not going to be good for structure, so they were torn down. Or the pieces that were damaged would be removed. So I'm going to use my own town as an example. This town actually suffered a great fire in 1910, right in the ballpark of where they talk about. I've been in the basements of some of the buildings that did burn down in that fire, and there are still scorch marks in the basements. Keep in mind, nobody's seeing the basement because it's not the first floor of the building. And it's the basement, so they don't really care about cleaning it to make it look pretty. So some of those scorch marks are still present. Uh, the specific shop I went into to check that out, it sadly, I don't think you can see it anymore because they actually turned it into a distillery. So they did remodel it so you can actually see into the basement. That's where they have some of their vats at. I don't know if it's that side or the other. I think the other side might still have the basement. Don't quote me on that. I know it's up for sale, so I'm pretty sure you could probably talk to the real estate person and actually check that out. Great thing with my town is it's also a great case study for the transitions in technology and both a growth and decline story. Uh, so let's talk about it. I know I've complained before. I think I've actually done a short about it where I complained that my town has a distinct lack of documentation on its early history. Because the town's actually older than what I'm about to say. And it's not because of some great conspiracy. It's actually because they weren't storing documents properly in Lancaster County when my town was part of Lancaster County. So we don't have some of the property deeds that would have survived. We have to rely on the archaeology. We have to rely on recognizing like that structure is a little bit older than that structure and stories, I shouldn't say stories, written documents from other parts of the state that reference this area. Middletown was officially as Middletown, not as an earlier settlement, which there were three actually. Getting carried away here. Middletown, as it is today, was founded in 1757. Earlier, William Penn had actually visited the site, and he mentions in one of the documents around the confluence of the Swadera into the Susquehanna, he wanted to have a centralized city. It would have been able to be safe from attack, and because of the Susquehanna River, there was a plan for it to actually reach down to Baltimore because of the Chesapeake Bay. The idea for the canals go back for a very long time. It wasn't until the 19th century that they were able to start doing it. So I think that might be where some of these misconceptions of the canals are coming from. Yes, they were planned very early, but they weren't built until later. Middletown is full of buildings dating from about 1760s, possibly earlier, well into the Cold War, and of course, new construction. Uh, this town, because of its location, you got to keep in mind, right across the river would have been the frontier. There would have been traders going up and down the Susquehanna River. Harrisburg would eventually become the capital city. This whole region was being crisscrossed, started with the rivers and the streams. Then it moved on to the canals, then the railroads, and now today the highways. There were a lot of investors in the railroads and the canals who lived in this area. There were also factories. Uh, One of my favorite, can't remember the name of the factory off the top of my head, but if you're somebody who collects bomber jackets, this town actually is the one who made some of the bomber jackets during World War II. There was a lot of industry going on in the Susquehanna Valley. Steelton owes its name to the steel mills. Some of this began very early on. There were a lot of people making a lot of money. Thing is, during the Great Fire of 1910, not everything burned. And there's also smaller fires before that. One of the places I used to live, when I dig in the garden, there was a layer of ash and charcoal, and it came from a tannery that had actually burned down. And then my house had started from a building, I think from the 1860s. It was a small shack. They moved it there from another street and built the actual what became my house on top of it. Of course, that's not what the Tartarian believers are focused on. A lot of them are obsessed with the Art Nouveau, a lot of the later Victorian architectural movements. And my town has a lot of those too. They survived the fire. There's two restaurants. One of them actually used to be a bank, and two others are apartment buildings. The point is, these are public buildings. You can visit them. If you get involved with different groups, you decide to work at one of them, or yeah, you can even tour them. You can see parts of them that might be untouched by the modern world. They still have a lot of the wrought iron or the cast iron, the decorations. They like they didn't really do anything to them. They often repaint them in the way they were painted in the time period, and they're made from brownstone. In fact, one of the restaurants I mentioned is called the Brownstone. So you've got that really reddish brown, like this rust colored stone mixed with this painted ironwork and things like that. Subjectively, it's gorgeous. I can understand why you might think there's something supernatural with them. And we also have tons of churches. There's this belief, I don't know if you've seen the posts on Facebook pop up about the spires on churches supposedly being some old power generator. Benjamin Franklin would have something to say about that, considering he invented the lightning rod. We know when they were built. We know when some of them were rebuilt. We know when they were renovated. We know it's in the spires. Usually, in some cases, they removed the bells because they needed metal for, you know, World War One, World War Two, probably even going back to the Civil War. So that's what happened to the bells. I know there's a conspiracy that the bells are magical. My grandmother on our farm used to have a really big old bell so that you could hear anywhere on the property. I think it was cool. Like if you need to get a hold of somebody that was out in the field before phones, that's great. Ding, ding, ding. Oh, well, dinner's done. Cool. There's an emergency, but by the time I grew up, there's usually a hornet's nest that would make its way into there, and can't tell you the number of times I was chased trying to play with the bell. There's nothing supernatural about it. Yeah, it's cool, but we have modern technology. We don't need bells like that anymore. They are cool though when places do have them. And the thing is, with this town, the oldest churches aren't even that ornate. There's the oldest one we have, St. Peter's Kirk. I did not misspeak. That's what it's called. It's German. It's just simple church. 18th century. It's You can go visit the cemeteries. There's a graveyard with that church, and then the town cemetery nearby. Graveyard's next to a church. a cemetery is its standalone thing. There are 18th century graves in both locations. In fact, one of the town founders was buried in the cemetery itself. And you can visit that, check the dates. I mean, that would be one hell of a conspiracy to have multiple stonemasons across every continent making graves. That's I don't think anybody gets that invested with their conspiracies. Those graves bring us to another point the Tartaria, the annoying T's bring up. How could people build these things? Now, this one made me scratch my head the first time I encountered it. See, I thought they were trolling the people that talk about how could the ancient Egyptians build the pyramids? I thought they were going, how could those Europeans build this thing? I thought that's what it was about, and I was like, "Oh, cool! I'm in for this joke. This is cool." And then I started reading the comments where I'm like, "Oh, you're being serious." There's one guy in particular who's on Facebook. He was older than me by about 2 decades. This is very important. Here's why. When I worked for the National Civil War Museum, huge shout out to them. Awesome, awesome museum, great collection. Visit it. Uh, Harrisburg was the location of Camp Curtin during the Civil War, which was basically like what's it called today? Fort Moore. It used to be called Fort Benning. Basically, what that is today, that's what they had in Harrisburg. So, yeah, there is actually an important reason for that building to be in Harrisburg and not somewhere else. Harrisburg was important. It was the target. It was actually what General Lee was planning to go after, and then instead they got diverted in Gettysburg, and we know the rest of that story. So, anyway, I was working there, and one of the volunteers he was heading on 100 years old. Like he was old. Sadly, no longer with us. He's an amazing guy. Vast store of knowledge in his brain. And one of the reasons he was so good, he had actually met Civil War veterans. He was old enough, he had met Civil War veterans. He had been a kid at the time, but he was one of those kids like me who loved talking to older people to learn, oh, what was it like back then? What happened? What happened? So one day, him and I were complaining about the cost of reenacting gear because he'd dress up as a reenactor and he'd give his presentations, things like that. And we were having this conversation, griping about the cost of stuff. And he starts laughing. I'm like, what? And he told me a story about one of his neighbors. Like, he'd go and hang out, listen to the old stories and everything else. One of his neighbors actually gave him a revolver from the Civil War. This, like, any of you who have become very friendly with some of your elderly neighbors, yeah, they sometimes might give you something. Like, I remember I used to get so much military surplus from some of the elderly folks. The thing was, it was just be nice to people. It's a very strong thing. Like, oh, you're hanging out with me. I don't need this anymore. You're interested in it? Here, take it. I love that mentality growing up. And that's the sort of thing we were talking about. And at that point in time, that revolver was worthless. I mean, probably get a little bit for it, but it wasn't life-changing money. Today, because it has provenance, it's thousands of dollars. But that's the thing. This was somebody who existed in the time period that the Tartarian folks don't believe happened. Well, I got to talking to this guy a little bit more, and he finally blocked me because once I realized how old he was, I'm like, you didn't talk to anybody? You got to remember, there are people right now living today who were conscious when Like they weren't babies. They would have been kids. Some of them even adults that are still alive today when the last Civil War veteran died. Gets a little spooky if you think about it. Even if they didn't know a Civil War veteran, they would have known people from the 19th century. These people are still alive. You're only a generation away from them. I don't. It'd be weird if there was somebody from the 19th century alive. They'd be in the record books. But that's the thing. It's not even that. I think it's 123, I want to say, is like the world record. That's not that far away from being born in the 19th century. I don't think there's anybody today again, but when you think about it that way, you at least know somebody who knew somebody who was alive then. So it's me getting on soapbox a little bit. Actually, I feel like this whole video has been me getting on soapbox. This is one of these situations within the world where we have a distinct lack of communication. When I was a kid, I loved talking to my grandparents. I would ask them every question I could think of. What was this like? How'd you do this? What happened with this? What happened with that? Now, it did cause me to have a bias. I do have a fear of banks because they were Great Depression era. But because of them, I learned to have a DIY mentality. I learned how to do things on my own. One of my biggest issues with modern technology is it's really tough to be DIY about it unless in some cases you actually have to go to school to learn some of this stuff. Cars though, like I've fixed cars before. They're mechanical. It's something I can see and recognize and know what to do. I can understand somebody in their 30s or younger not having that connection because there's sadly not that many people alive who went through all of that. But guarantee you know somebody who knew somebody who did. In this guy's case, again, he was old enough to have known people that, well, actually, come to think of it, that would have been okay. No, he was not old enough to have met anybody from the Civil War, but he still would have been within the age range where he would have met World War I veterans. I met one. That was it. And the thing was, I didn't really have a chance to ask them the questions I wish I could have because I was too young. I didn't know anything. I didn't know enough to know what questions to ask. It was just like, oh, cool. You were in World War One? That was a long time ago. So, and for those of you who get opportunities to get interviewed by historians, do it. Seriously. Even if, like, oh, I was just down the street when this historical event happened. Your perception matters. And 100 years from now, people will be reading the transcript or actually watching the video and be like, okay, so that's what happened. Okay, now I understand. That's history. History is being made every day. This is history right here. Your comments are history. Just remember that. Where was I? Thought I was trying to stay on track. So, what would be the point for all these people to lie to you? One of the things that the Tartarians like to bring up are the World's Fairs. Many of these, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures from the World's Fairs. Like, it was this big festival of all the latest technology. There was also stuff from the future, and sometimes they'd build ancient monuments. There was a lot of cultural appropriation. At one point, there was ice cream. In fact, I think ice cream cones. I think that's, if I remember correctly, they started at World's Fairs. The 1964 World's Fair in New York was not a cover up for Aliens. That was a movie, Men in Black. Definitely worth a watch. I've always wanted a pug, by the way, and name it Frank. I don't want to shake. I only study them when something with them intersects. So when I used to study like the 19th century, sometimes there'd be a lot of conversation about like the revolvers and things. Like there'd be revolver displays at the World's Fair, things like that. I have never actually studied them directly. I want to eventually because they're kind of cool, but at the same time, they're really kitschy. Uh, I'll study them whenever it intersects with H.H. Holmes. Yeah. Uh, if you're not sure who he is, actually look him up, and I'll tell you why. I'm not going to do a video on him unless I visit some place in Pennsylvania that does have an association with him. There is a site I do want to visit very soon for part of the press yard, which I might get into him at. Casual Criminalist does an excellent video on him. He doesn't get too wild with speculation or anything like that. It's very nice, sober video. I love it. One of the things H.H. Holmes did was during one of the World's Fairs, I forget which one, I'll probably put it somewhere. He built his murder hotel. There's a lot of speculation about how complex it was, and a lot of it's true, and a lot of it's false. But the thing is, we have the construction records because part of that is his criminal record. We know people that he conned as investors. We know one of the builders. There's a little bit with that. I don't want to spoil too much. Yeah, the buildings tore down and it was very mysterious and really bad things did happen there. But we have the documents about it. We know about it. We have the criminal record. That's another place to look if you're trying to figure out documents. Look in criminal records. Sometimes you can find references to things and be like, oh, that. Again, when I first heard that those before 1900 couldn't build the buildings that have survived to present, I was, I again thought it was a joke. Nearly everything I make using the tools of the time period. Now, if I want to do something quick, just as a little experiment or just something personal for me, I'll sometimes break out the Dremel. Like if I'm carving a coconut, yeah, I'll sometimes use the Dremel. Sometimes I'll do the rough carving with the Dremel, but then I go in with the hand tools because I don't care how good you are with a Dremel, you can always see those marks. I know somebody's going, but what about the marks on the stones of Egypt? Again, watch the videos I mentioned before. They explain them very well. Or try some of the methods yourself, you'll see the same thing. Anyway, I know plenty of people do things by hand. I'm one of them. A good chunk of my friends list are people that do things like that. Thing is, even when I'm cooking at events, I would say I think I only ever had one event where this question was not asked, maybe two. I always have a grown adult come up to me. How are you making it look like you're actually cooking? And I've had people ask, I can't believe you're trying to make me believe you're actually cooking that. I've had things like that where people have actually gotten angry because they think I'm somehow faking cooking. There they are. Tartarians like to use empiricism incorrectly. It's a skill, it's a lack of skill. They are standing there with their eyes. They can smell, they can hear the sizzling. Uh, Depending on the event, they might even be able to get a taste. They can see all of that. They can feel the heat coming off. And they believe I am faking it. Now, if I had a baked good, I'd probably be faking it because unless I'm unless I do have access to an oven or unless there's a technique that I can do, it's a disconnect from basic skills. Now, there were power tools in the 19th century. This is where power tools start to be developed. Even before electricity, you start having power tools. Actually, they technically go back even further than that. Uh, there were saws that were water powered. steam power, things like that. It existed. Uh, Cranes and pulleys. Cranes and pulleys go back at least to Rome, but I mean, again, there was the early medieval period that people erroneously call the Dark Age. The same technologies that were used to make trebuchets were also used to make cranes. I, for some reason, I think people imagine, oh, they built it by hand, and there's some, hey, Steve, go climb up that wall there with a brick on your back and put the brick up top. No, that's not how that worked. You would have a crane lifting things up. Scaffolding goes back. Like a lot of the Gothic structures in Europe, they had immense scaffolding. And we know that because there's plans for it. The plans still exist. Artist interpretations still exist. We understood gears, we understood ratcheting systems. Like there's no mystery with this. People are like, yeah, how did they do that exactly? That could be a problem. Well, how'd they fix it? Well, we have experimental archaeologists who do that. Uh, Technically speaking, I guess when it comes to cooking, I'm an experimental archaeologist. I take the history, I take the artifacts, and I figure out, okay, how'd they do this? What did this taste like? What did this look like? Let's do this. Uh, Todd Cutler, he's built a trebuchet. He actually has it for sale. Todd's Workshop, check him out. He does a lot of this. We know how this happened. Sometimes we don't know exactly, but that's what we're here for, is to figure out, okay, how they do. Okay, that's now it makes sense. If you were a construction worker and you time traveled back to 1200, you would recognize what people were doing. They might not have power tools, but you would be very familiar with it. The surveying techniques, again, cranes, pulley systems, scaffolding. Now, they'd have to use hammers, shovels, picks, things like that. Yeah, but it would be familiar. That said, this is the one time I get to confirm a conspiracy. When you're talking about a lot of these stone buildings, Freemasons did it. Literal members of the Guild of Masons did a lot of the stone buildings that we see in the major cities today. Masonry, even as a modern technology, is still technically an art form. It requires an understanding of the material, how best to cut it to get the shape that's needed. If you're getting into more of like the like doing sculpture and stuff, yeah, that's art. You with a lot of crafts, you have to have a feel for it. It's not supernatural. It's just you've worked with the item long enough. It's like, okay, I need to do it this way, but there's an imperfection here that's telling me I'm going to have to do it this way. The guilds helped regulate to make sure, like, hey, uh, Jimmy's new. He doesn't know what he's doing. He thinks he does, and that's a problem. And over time, some of these guilds became secret societies, which we have today. Freemasons literally were Masons. The symbols of the Masons are the symbols of the Masons. Also, no, I'm not a Freemason. The same reason I didn't join fraternities in college. I don't like paying money for things like that. I'd rather just like, hey, I want information freely available to people. You want to be my friend? Be my friend. Cool. Uh, the finishing techniques, they haven't really changed. I mean, we have sandpaper, we have power tools, things like that now. They were using sand in ancient Egypt. If you wonder how'd they get that polished so fine, literally the same way we do it today, just without the extra steps. Yeah, it took a longer time, but people wanted to do that stuff. And why would they do that? Well, for their government, for their religion. Yes, there was a bit of a carrot and a stick thing going on. But if we go back to Susquehannock, building the eel weirs, there was mostly the carrot. A lot of us who get in the practice of doing some of these old things, we get very fast at it. That a lot of the experimental archaeologists, there's the whole complaint about, well, you couldn't do that in that length of time. I mean, oh, it took you 10 minutes to only go like this much. Oh, they wouldn't have done that. Guaranteed, if you practice that skill more and more, you would learn like, okay, I need to put a little pressure more here. I need to do this a little bit differently. And you would get faster. Sewing, it's a great example. When I first started sewing, I didn't understand how to use a thimble. To this day, I rarely use a thimble. So, I mean, actually, my hand looks pretty good right now. I've gotten better. Uh, but that's the thing. I've been doing it long enough that I am very fast. There are people, it will take them, well, let's go with a jacket. Most of the time, my jackets, if I am just focused on the jacket, nothing else, no other orders, I can usually get a jacket done. Like, we're talking, let's go with a sleeved waistcoat. So, about knee length with sleeves and pockets. I can usually get one of those done in a weekend. And that's just working normal business hours. There's people today with sewing machines who don't even get it done that quickly. And it's not again nothing against them. It's just I've been doing it longer. So for me, hand stitching something like that, it's nothing. It's I get a better product at the end, and because I'm not using the sewing machine, I have time to be a dad. I can pay attention to what's going on around me. I can do other things. I can listen to true crime and I can watch history videos and research conspiracy videos while I'm working. Again, we still have people today doing things the old way. I'm going to have some links at the end of, well, not at the end, but in the comments of, or description rather, about some of the different sites and people that you can check out. Like they do things the traditional methods. In the past, you couldn't just run down to Harbor Freight and grab a cheap hammer. You had to go to the blacksmith and get a hammer. If your hammer, for whatever reason, shattered, you had to go get a hammer from the blacksmith. The blacksmith is not going to want to cheat you. He wants to make sure you have a good product that's going to last because he wants that reputation so he gets more customers. That's why, like, you will find, like, like I mentioned, hammers right there. Even nails. Like, your nails would have been hand forged. It was not something you just popped in a machine, boom, done. There's 100 of them. I have a short here from Fort Loudon. Ian, he does stuff with Crew the Fancy. He's also a blacksmith at Fort Loudon. It's him making nails. Those nails have become so valuable, like you would literally burn down an abandoned house to get nails. Even into the 20th century, even with big companies like Singer sewing machines, their sewing machines throughout much of the 20th century, they just need a little tweaking to make them work. Uh, I actually bought one when I used to do 20th century stuff. It was an electrified model, but they also made the same model with a hand crank. All the parts were there. All you had to do was attach a hand crank to it. And because these machines are still used today, they are still common and they are surviving and thriving. There's actually a market for parts for them. But encourage human artists. If you can't buy it, share their work, get them noticed. Seriously, like there's no conspiracy. It's literally just people's tastes change and money. Speaking of which, at the very beginning, I mentioned a lot of this theory is internet age, and as thus, I think it is very much an internet problem. Here I am taking a break from sewing to talk to you on the internet. This is 2020. Many museums and archives had time to start cataloging their information and making it available. There is so much more actual history available online now than ever before. There is research I could never have dreamed of doing in 2019. The cost of visiting the archives across multiple countries would have made much of what I do a pipe dream. There's frankly no excuse by any of these purveyors to claim there isn't evidence. When we are talking about it was made up, really. So we all as a historical community sat down and made everything from church records, poems, architectural designs, personal letters, diaries, sometimes very raunchy letters, poems, paintings, store orders, shop orders, insurance information, royal decrees, minor crime reports, new laws. And then, I don't know, we went and we made up a whole bunch of different stones with different births and deaths and put them all around the world. When I say we have evidence for something that was built in the 16 or 1700s, I'm not just talking about one letter, one document. We have stacks of documents, either specifically about the construction or referencing it. I wish we had that many documents for that era about mundane things. People didn't care about their shirts or jacket unless there was something special. Like right now, I'm wearing a black shirt. 100 years from now, if you don't see this, if you're just listening to the audio, well, what sort of black shirt? Is it a button down? What is it? I'm not explaining it. That's how most of these letters were. Now, the cool new building by Christopher Wren being built where there had been a fire. Oh, yeah, they're writing that down because this is something new. This is something cool. So they're writing it down. We don't know what hat is he talking about. Sometimes we don't even know if like a particular fabric was popular. We have to go off of like, oh, they made a law against this, or there's a trade document that says that. A lot of that is guesswork. But these buildings, they're not. When I talked about Seattle earlier, we have photographs. We have before and after photographs. We have construction photographs. We have construction records. We have newspapers. We have all of that. What's really cool though, nearby Seattle, I think it's in Oregon. I want to say it's Northwest. Uh, there are very important sites that predate Clovis. If you know what Clovis is, good for you. If you don't, please educate yourself. No, they don't have massive architecture. We're going back to me talking about, oh, I found some charcoal and some little flakes of stone. Those were people. And another cool thing, there's been some studies on the oral traditions of the indigenous people, the First Nations people, literally, like this is one of these moments of they were definitely the First Nations people. There's no criticism about that. There's oral traditions about events that happened about like right in that zone where we've been unsure about, but there are stories about it happening, meaning people witnessed like volcanic eruptions and things like that. Like to me, that is amazing. We have a more accurate date on the volcano because of I don't understand the chemistry that well. I let people that understand it explain it to me. We have very good accurate dating on when some of these volcanic eruptions happened. And that allows us to take that story, this oral tradition has been passed down. That allows us to actually take that and date when that started. And it's amazing. The internet, sadly, as much as it could, does not unite us. Thanks to the algorithm, it pushes people into information bubbles. And with the reliance on technology, it makes things of the past seem impossible. The person who should be seeing my short from the blacksmith shop at Fort Loudon of them making nails is instead seeing somebody saying, oh, everything had to come from Atlantis because people weren't advanced enough to do things like that. It reinforces a worldview that is a lie. Because outrage feeds the algorithm, channels like this and others get buried unless we do an angry video like this. So, yeah, I guess there is a conspiracy in a way. Disinformation is a huge problem in the online community. Back in the old days, if you wanted conspiracies, you had to go out and find a tabloid or tune into a late night radio show. Or, maybe smoke a little something with your friends and come up with the wackiest ideas you can. Now, it is very rare to get online today and not see something that is, at the very least, wrong, if not intentionally false. This is problematic because it normalizes it. As I know some of you are going, well, just let them believe. No, let's get to this. If you believe in aliens, that is great. Have fun with it. Where it becomes harmful is when these beliefs become popular enough to affect public policy and even the courts. So when you're saying, don't trust the experts, you vote. Chances are you're voting for somebody that agrees with you. I can think of a few right now who say very similar things to that are in office making decisions for you and me. These beliefs have ramifications. And no, you're not just, I'm asking questions. We exist now in a world where people confuse opinions with facts, and they think every single statement is valuable. I've experienced what happens when people will believe any story they hear without lack of evidence. And yes, it does affect the court system. It does affect law enforcement. Normalizing this sort of misinformation, or I personally feel disinformation, that does affect people's lives. Spreading false vaccine information, that's a great example of that one. I thought about ending the video right there. Historians and archaeologists are some of the poorest smart people you will ever meet. We love what we do, which is why we do it. Many of us try to find ways of making it work. In my case, it's sewing. Others have monetized channels and merch. Some get good at university jobs, which still aren't that good. And sometimes others break it in just enough that they can start selling books to the general public. That's awesome. But a lot of us obsess over what sort of hat did workers wear in the 17th century. Most of you don't care about that. Actually, if you're subscribed to the channel, you probably do. I've actually been told that that would be a very interesting read, and now I'm thinking about actually writing that book. FYI. I'd love to get those big time Smithsonian dollars, but even they don't pay as well as other careers. This is not a conspiracy. Do you realize how much we'd get paid if we actually brought evidence of giants, lost civilizations, aliens? Do you realize how much we'd get paid by the media? Hey, I got this giant. You want to check it out? Oh, you're full. No, I do. You can have an independent lab research it. Oh, wait, you do. You just how big of a paycheck that would be? No, instead we have Netflix paying Graham Hancock to run around the world without any evidence. Dude, if I could go to Jamaica and they just gave me food, a place to stay. Actually, I wouldn't even need the place to stay. Just let me sleep somewhere in a tent and let me explore some of the sites I've talked about. My God, I'd be so happy. No, instead, we have this. If we were hiding evidence, trust me, all of us would have cashed in already. I know I would have. If you want to learn more about history, there are plenty of resources online, and if you don't like reading, there are channels like mine out there. Most are even better. Mine sucks. My production quality is awful. I try to take a popular topic and use it as a vehicle to teach boring things. But if you want to experience it, start with something small like cooking. There are plenty of historical cookbooks out there and channels like Max Miller and Townsend's. You get hosts who can help you interpret things which often don't even have measurements. It's not building a cathedral, but it's eating the same food as the builders. And once you get a good meal and you practice that, maybe one day you'll get to build that cathedral. Don't let grifters gaslight you into thinking you can't do things. If I was to believe a conspiracy, it would be that folks like Hancock are being pushed by popular media to make people think that we are incapable of excellence so that maybe they can replace us with AI, make us work dead end jobs for even less pay, or force us into buying refrigerators that barely last 3 years. Don't fall into that. Our ancestors were survivors. They were thinkers, they were dreamers. Every single one of them was just as capable of doing amazing things as you are now. Get out there, be amazing. Thank you. Have an awesome day. So, I just finished up this video and checked my phone and just got an awesome email that 100% pertains to this video. So, as a little spoiler at the end, I think I might have to go do a little walking and I might get my feet wet.